Thanks so much for doing this. I was hoping you could just first introduce yourself and then maybe talk a bit about why you think we need new funding models for the financing of aid.
Well, my name is Dr. Samantha Nutt. I'm the author of a book, Damned Nations, Greed, Guns, Armies, and Aid, and I am also a founder of War Child. And in terms of new funding models for aid, it's not so much that we need new funding models, but we definitely need new approaches to aid. And those new approaches to aid are only possible if new funding models exist. And one of the major themes of my book actually looks at why it is that we need to be invested when it comes to aid over longer periods of time. It takes no less than a generation to see the effects of well-managed aid. It takes almost a full generation of ongoing partnership and commitment to arrive at that, to begin to actually see those results. And unfortunately, we end up chasing a lot of crises around the world, heavily investing in relief responses at the expense of development responses, when we know that if we maintain those kinds of ongoing initiatives, that's when we begin to really see indicators change, indicators around health, around education, around the rights of women and children. You know, those are the types of things that really depend on development funding.
And are governments then not good at providing that long-term funding?
Well, actually, no, they're not. I mean, some governments are. You know, from a governmental point of view, long-term funding is somewhere between 3 and 5 years. A lot of the funding that's available is short course funding. It's emergency international humanitarian assistance funding, which is usually anywhere from 6 months to a year. You have to reapply every single year. The budgets might change. Sometimes there's a huge gap between when you last had a grant and when you get the next one renewed. And so organizations are in a situation where they might lose some of their most valuable staff. There might have to be layoffs. All of that institutional capacity is lost. And again, two priorities change. I mean, one country, one particular crisis might be in the news, and there might be, you know, a significant amount of political interest in it. And then 2 years later, we don't see that momentum being maintained, and there are cutbacks to aid funding to those countries, and that definitely, creates certain perceptions on the ground that are not conducive to progress.
In your op-ed, you describe this emergence of this private-public model. Is that in some way a response to this government inadequacy of funding, or what's leading to the emergence of that new model?
Well, it's been a model that's been coming out over the last few years. We've definitely seen more private sector and nonprofit sector partnership, particularly when it comes to international development initiatives. We see more corporate funding in the form of sponsorship events, ongoing funding of specific projects. What I write about in this Globe editorial is something, though, that's quite new, which is actually the Canadian International Development Agency directly funding relief and development organizations to work with Canadian mining firms that have operations in the countries in which these programs will take place. So what we're seeing, just to sort of summarize that for you, what we're seeing is CETA providing grants to Canadian organizations that are willing to work directly with Canadian mining firms in the countries in which they have a vested interest. And this raises a huge number of ethical questions around the autonomy of non-governmental organizations, around their capacity, if they're receiving funding from mining firms, to actually bear witness to human rights violations and labor violations that they might be seeing on the ground. So these are some of the criticisms. You know, obviously, though, with something like this, one of the advantages is that people see this as an alternative when you're in the middle of an economic recession. There's less and less funding that's actually available. Now you've got these for-profit, non-profit partnerships that are emerging that might actually provide the kind of sustainable funding that the groups are looking for. But the real question then becomes, at what cost?
And what is the slippery slope there? Is it the state getting out of the aid game more?
In terms of you're talking about whether CETA and others scaling back?
Yeah, is this part of an effort to transfer the responsibility of aid to the private sector?
Well, I think that there has certainly been there's been an increasing prominence of the private sector within aid and development over the past decade, and you're starting to see corporations for-profit corporations receiving aid grants. And this was whether you're talking about private contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, whether you're talking about firms that are being given multi-million-dollar contracts from groups like CETA to do temporary housing in Haiti. The sort of business of aid and emergency relief is there are more for-profit players that are operating within the sector. That's for sure. Do I see it as a way for governments to get out of the business of aid? No, I mean, I'm not so cynical as to believe that. I think what governments are looking for, though, more and more is what they consider to be added value. So they're looking to see whether charities are arriving with additional funders and additional partners so that the government is only providing one share of the budget and then other money is coming from elsewhere. And that's extremely attractive, both to individual donors that support organizations, to those organizations, and to the Canadian government, because there's a sense that taxpayers are getting added value from that. But again, it raises some very significant questions around the autonomy of aid organizations and the role of aid organizations as incubators of social movements. Obviously, the more organizations are actually receiving significant amounts of funding, whether it's from governmental groups or for-profit groups, the more that can certainly impede their ability to speak out, to bear witness, and to criticize groups that they see are involved in abuses around the world.
Does that decentralization get at any of the critiques of the state aid regime that you've pointed out? Like, what are the potential benefits of this?
What are the potential benefits of this? Well, when you look at if you're looking at different development challenges around the world, if you really do want to break the cycle of poverty and despair and violence, you need a bunch of things to be happening at once. You certainly need to be making sure people's acute needs are being met. But we also know that economic development is important. It's one important factor. It's not the only important factor. And I think that there are a number of economists who've been trying to make the case, whether it's Demis Moyo or others, that really all you need is economic investment, and all of these other things will follow from that. I don't subscribe to that point of view. I think that economic development is one piece of it. You also need social development in the form of education, of health spending, of promoting local capacity, engaging those communities, promoting good governance, working with local governments to achieve those goals. So you could make the case, certainly, that by creating those nonprofit, for-profit alliances, that you have a better chance of all of these pieces coming together.